Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Let's get started. Good morning, and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here's today's question of the moment. How significant is the latest round of U.S. tariffs? On Wednesday, President Trump announced the floor of 10% on all goods entering the U.S., with a few exceptions. But for some, the rates will be far higher. The new tariff increases include 20% on goods coming in from Europe, 24% on imports from Japan, 26% on Indian imports, and 34% on goods coming from China. The new tariffs will add onto existing levies, so Chinese imports now face a total rate of 54%. And this follows earlier tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and auto parts. So how does this moment stack up? Joining us now is one of the clearest voices on the history and implications of U.S. trade policy. Douglas Irwin is John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College, and he is also the author of Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy. Doug, welcome to The Call.
It's nice to be here.
Doug, these measures seem to mark a major reversal in a decades-long U.S. trade policy that sought to lower trade barriers. How do you assess this moment?
It's truly of historic significance. If you look at the average tariff that U.S. applies to imports over time, and you can take that back to 1790, it's very high and volatile in the 19th century. And then you're right, after World War II, it really comes down to relatively low levels, very sort of flat, very consistent. So there's a lot of certainty with that. And now they just are jumping almost straight up, almost to levels that we haven't seen since the 1880s or 1890s. The current average tariff on total imports is about 2% last year, and it's expected to jump up to about 30% once you add in all these new tariffs. So that's a huge discontinuity in the long history of U.S. trade policy.
Was there anything about, we're all processing a lot of information here, but I was just wondering if something stood out from the announcement yesterday.
Well, first of all, we got a little bit of clarity on what the goals of the administration were. I mean, there's been sort of this kaleidoscope of we want tariffs to raise revenue, to pay for tax cuts. We want tariffs to cut deals, reciprocal trade deals with other countries, and get them to get rid of their tariffs and other barriers. We want to reshore jobs and bring factories back and reindustrialize America. We want to get rid of the trade deficit. So all these things are sort of objectives. Some of them are contradictory. If you're really using the tariffs to raise revenue, then you don't want imports to shrink so much. But if you want these tariffs to reshore jobs and squeeze out and allow domestic manufacturers to expand, then you want to squeeze out imports. And so you lose the revenue. So there's all these trade-offs. But behind the formula that the administration used to levy these tariffs was the idea that it's the bilateral trade balance that is going to be the proxy for all the quote unquote unfair trade practices. Economists would really question that, but at least we know that the mechanism or the indicator they're going for is trying to reduce the trade deficit on a bilateral basis.
So I noticed that the goods that are covered under the USMCA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, are going to be exempt from these tariffs. I think that's a little bit of good news for those who rely on those supply chains that cross the borders here in North America. Am I right about that?
You are, in the sense that yesterday Canada and Mexico are not brought up at all, but they have sort of the sword of Damocles hanging over them, 25% tariffs. Those have been twice postponed by the administration, but that situation is not resolved. That uncertainty is not resolved. And I think as of midnight last night, the auto tariffs take effect, including on auto parts. And so that's once again, that'll exempt many products in the NAFTA USMCA region, US, Canada, Mexico, but some will get tagged with that. So they're not out of the woods yet in terms of getting on good graces with the Trump administration.
So overnight, we're already seeing some retaliation coming. Do you see that as escalating in the days ahead?
This is a really interesting question, and there's a lot of uncertainty about this. So a lot of countries talked a good game about retaliation, certainly the European Union, certainly China and others. But now the question is how open the administration will be to getting rid of these tariffs through negotiations, or at least modifying them. In that case, the strategy of other countries might be to go to Washington, and offer something up to try to mitigate the harm that's being done to them with these tariffs. So I think Canada's talked about retaliation, Mexico less so, European Union, yes, but they have to really think about their strategy and whether there's an opening to get these tariffs significantly reduced by not retaliating and offering something up in terms of concessions.
Doug, if you were the president of a major U.S. trading partner, how would you respond if the United States suddenly slapped 30% tariffs on the goods that were coming into this country?
Well, I think, as my last answer suggested, I think my initial reaction would be you have to hit back equally. Particularly, we're hitting countries that we have free trade agreements with: South Korea, Australia. Um, Australia, we have a U.S. The U.S. has a trade surplus with Australia, yet they're still getting hit with 10% tariffs. So that's a complete affront in some sense, a violation of the whole idea of reciprocity as being the motivation for these tariffs. I should also add that the U.S. did not include service trade with in terms of calculating these things. So it's just based on merchandise. And of course, the U.S. has a big trade surplus when it comes to services, but that was excluded from the calculation. So I think it really, if the administration is open to negotiations, that might temper the reprisals and see how negotiations go. If they don't go anywhere and the administration is not open to making changes, then I think more and more countries would opt for retaliation.
Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of our audience members is asking, what is the likelihood of individual country adjustments in exchange for agreements and stepping up, like in the form of investment in the United States? Is that something that you see a lot of people offering as a way of avoiding these tariffs?
Certainly, that could be the case. And once again, I think the Trump administration, or at least the president himself, is always open to deals, is open to flattery and concessions from others. No statement was made yesterday that I saw that indicated that they would be open to these. And in fact, the president sometimes sort of been of two minds with respect to exemptions. So in his first term, we imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, and a lot of exemptions were granted. And he sort of said, I don't want to do that this time. But at the same time, he's also said he's sort of open for a deal. So I think there's a lack of clarity right now. It's been very soon since the announcement, but a lack of clarity on the extent to which exemptions, getting rid of these tariffs through discussions over the coming weeks and months, is going to be an option.
Now, you raised exemptions. We got a lot of questions from our audience members on exemptions, and I'll just pick one that's representative. What are the prospects for any exclusions for products that are not available in the United States?
Well, historically, that's been the case. Anytime the U.S. has imposed retaliatory tariffs, there's been this sort of opt out where Department of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative's office sort of work with industry to allow those imports in and be exempt from the duties. But once again, there's always been a lack of clarity on what's going to happen in this particular instance. I think as more and more businesses find that they can't get access to supplies, that things just simply aren't produced here in the U.S., there's going to be a lot of pressure on the administration to grant such exemptions, and we'll just have to see what happens.
Okay, we're having a member asking for a clarification. So Canada and Mexico are exempt from across the board 10% tariffs under those things that are covered under the USMCA. Is that correct?
That's my understanding from yesterday. Once again, they didn't come up in the press conference and well, it wasn't press conference, the announcement. And I think they're sort of viewed as being in a separate bucket. So the administration is dealing with USMCA, but then dealing with the rest of the world yesterday. But once again, those 25% tariffs have not been on Canada and Mexico have not been rescinded. They've just been paused. And there could be a renewal of that pause. But unless there's some sort of final settlement, I think there's always going to be a threat that the tariffs on USMCA goods will be raised at some point.
I'd like to look at the historical context of this. We've had periods of very high tariff levels in the past. You argue in your book that during the Gilded Age, it didn't necessarily hurt growth. It was kind of neutral. But the economy today is very, very different, with the interdependencies between countries being much higher than it was in the past. And I just wonder if we can expect past precedent to really augur, a path forward today.
No, I think things are really different on two dimensions. One is that the level of integration, as you pointed out, of the U.S. with the rest of the world is much higher now than it was in the 19th century. So imports of just merchandise are about 11% of GDP. When you include services, it goes up to about 14% of GDP. But when you go back to the Gilded Age or even the early 20th century, the trade share was only about 5% of GDP. So that's more than double today where we were relative to the past. And the nature of trade is also very different. Back then, it was a lot of trade in final goods or bulk commodities, whereas today we have the fragmentation of global production. So there's so many intermediate goods, so many industrial components, so many inputs to production that are traded, not just the final goods, the final textiles. And that's part of firms' production process. And there's global sourcing of many different components from many different countries. The logistics of coordinating that are incredibly complex. And this is just really ripping up some of those supply chains and making much more complicated businesses opportunities to work with suppliers in other countries.
So we have made several transitions as an economy over the past couple of centuries. We started out as an agrarian economy, shifting to an industrial one, characterized by manufacturing, and then manufacturing gave way to services. Through tariffs, can you revive and go back to to the earlier stages of that transition? Can we go back to a broad manufacturing economy by taxing these goods that are coming in from overseas, or has the train pretty much set the station on this?
Well, it's sort of ironic. We have a president who grew up in the 20th century, who now operates in the 21st century, but wants to go back to the 19th century. And it's really not going to work out the way he anticipates. We've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs a little bit because of trade in certain sectors, but largely because of automation. So if we think we're going to reshore the textile and apparel industry, we can bring back some of those factories, but they're going to be automated. It's very labor intensive. Workers in the US are probably not going to stand for doing that laborious work, even at high wages. And of course, the technology has changed. So the steel industry has always been a particular focus of the president. In the 1980s, it took 10 worker hours to produce a ton of steel. Now it takes 1 worker hour to produce a ton of steel. So we're still producing a lot of steel. Imports we could squeeze out a little bit, but we don't need nearly as many workers as we did in the past to produce that steel. In addition, the types of jobs in manufacturing have changed. So in the 1980s, it would be a lot of blue collar workers who were, physically undertaking the process of steel production. Today, it's a few engineers who are just monitoring the equipment because it's all capital intensive, very technology intensive. And that's the way when new factories come back, that's the way they're going to operate to cut costs.
Now, on a related question here, the Chamber supports some of the goals of this administration, from prosperous communities to secure borders. But just wondering, tariffs are taxes. And can you tax communities in ways that are going to revive production domestically, at a time when the cost of living is pretty high?
Well, this has been asked of me. I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, but right next door we have some communities that are truly deindustrialized and haven't done well for many decades. Partly that's a little bit because of globalization, but a lot of it is because where manufacturing is being done has changed. It's gone from the north to the south. So in Manchester, New Hampshire, there's a mile-long, huge brick building that used to produce shoes and textiles, but that closed down in the 1950s, and those moved to the South Carolina, North Carolina, and elsewhere. And so if we're trying to revive the industrial rust belt in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, what have you, through tariffs, it might help production in some states, but those states are going to be in the South, where a lot of the manufacturing production has relocated. It's not really going to revive the industrial North. You need a different set of policies, place-based policies, and states also have to look at what their policies are regarding investment and union rights and things of that sort to compete with the South. So there's as much competition between the states for this manufacturing as there is between the U.S. and the rest of the world.
Okay, here's an interesting question that was on my mind as well. To what extent do you expect the tariffs to simply drive down total U.S. demand rather than consumers paying higher prices? I mean, this also gets to the point where, there are different sources of inflation in the economy, inflationary pressures. This is not, this is not an increase in the money supply with more money chasing fewer goods. This is more of an input sort of pressure. I just wonder what your thoughts on what the economic outcome is. Is this going to be inflationary over the long term?
Yeah, I think economists are very reticent to or disinclined to use the term inflation with respect to tariffs. These are a one-off price increase on imported goods.
Right.
It's not, as you say, based on monetary policy. You know, Milton Friedman's injunction that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. It's not that. The Fed is not going to accommodate this. So we'd see measured CPI go up, but it would be a level effect that would drop out after a year. Although once again, these tariffs take time to work through the system, so the consumer price index could be elevated for some time, producer price indices and things of that sort. But it's not inflation in the standard sense of it. In fact, some prices of U.S. exports could go down if there's retaliation against U.S. grain exports. The price of corn, the price of soybeans is going to go down in the U.S., not up. So it's a change in relative prices. But at the same time, because so many imports are consumed by American households, that's a reduction in real income.
Yeah.
Your wages will not go as far as they did before when the price of automobiles goes up by $6,000, when the price of other goods that you buy, winter vegetables and things of that sort. So it is a shrinking of the U.S. economy. There have been many studies that show that we're going to lose between 0.3 to 0.6% of GDP. I don't think people have rerun the numbers with these higher tariffs. It could be a little bit higher than that. That might push us into recession. That's not good for American workers either. So a lot of factors moving at the same time.
So our audience members, a suggestion here that this might have a deleterious effect on demand is actually one that we need to be watching for then.
Absolutely. I mean, once again, cars is a classic example. People are going to postpone purchases of new cars, try to keep their old cars going, but even auto parts prices could be going up. So consumer confidence, as everyone knows, has plummeted just in the past 2 months. Business investment decisions are also being postponed because people don't know what the tariffs are. Well, now we know a little bit, but what the tariffs are going to be. Are they going to be permanent, temporary, on what commodities? And so business investment could freeze up. And if you get, GDP is C plus I plus G plus net exports of C and I, consumption and investment sort of are held in check for a moment. We could see the recession coming.
Okay, another question here. Is it expected that the administration will be sensitive to signals such as the stock market in developing an exemption strategy?
Could be, but President Trump has once again said very different things about the stock market this term as opposed to his first term when he was saying that it was reinforcing all of his good policies. Once again, I think the business community was looking for deregulation and tax cuts, and they're getting these massive tariff increases, which are at the very least hugely disruptive. Some sectors might benefit, but hugely disruptive and very costly to consumers and businesses. So that's not good, and that's why the markets are reacting the way they are. And the fact that this could spiral out of control, potentially with retaliation, certainly there'll be some, how much we don't exactly know, is not good for the economic outlook. And so you'd think that would soften up the administration a little bit to ease the blow on American business and American households. But I think that remains to be seen. The president has been a long-time advocate of higher tariffs, and this is his signature policy. And I don't think he wants to water it down so much with the exemptions the way he did in his first term.
Okay, now the latest round of tariffs have been executed under an obscure statute that gives the president emergency powers. Are trade deficits a national emergency?
Well, that's in the eye of the beholder, and the beholder here is the president. And so the legislation is written in a very vague way, where sometimes it can be balance of payments consideration. So that the trade deficit would fall under that. But you're pointing out something that's sort of unique historically as well. Anytime U.S. trade policy has changed in the past in a very big way, it's required a societal consensus or at least a political coalition to move things through the House and the Senate and get the president's approval. Unfortunately, Congress has really sort of delegated so many powers to the president under the assumption that the president would be sort of a normal actor, if you will, that Congress is really on the sidelines here. And we have one person who really thinks that we face this international economic emergency and wants to do something about it. That's the president, with no input from the House, no input from the Senate, very little input from the business community. And it's possible because of the delegation of powers. So I think that's an unfortunate development. Congress has really washed its hands of trade policy, and it's time for it to step up if it wants to represent what the American people really think.
All right, for our final question here, this is an interesting one. Is this a new age of unprecedented protectionism, or are we merely reverting to an earlier era when it was normal for countries to erect trade barriers?
One of the reasons why we sort of got rid of trade barriers is they weren't very good at raising revenue compared to income taxes or VATs. They weren't particularly good at ensuring manufacturing's viability because you're exporting manufactured goods as well as importing, and you lose those foreign markets when you impose high tariffs and you raise costs for businesses. It imposes externalities on others, so you get these reprisals. So we sort of put trade policy in Pandora in a box for the post-war period and said, this is not something we want to invoke very often. Yes, there are going to be exceptions with anti-dumping and countervailing duties, but it's not the best policy to achieve economic prosperity. And now that box has been opened. And the question is this a temporary or a more permanent shift? I think a lot of the rest of the world still values trade. They're not as big economies. They're much more open and vulnerable, and they see the advantages of globalization for them. But for the U.S., we're relatively insulated from trade, and we believe that we've been hurt as a result of trade. At least the president and some of his advisors and some industries do. And so this could be more permanent for the U.S. in terms of a shift in policy than it is for the rest of the world. The rest of the world still has the WTO. The rest of the world still has the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the rest of the world is going to start diversifying away from the U.S. as an untrustworthy market because they still value international trade. So it's a question of whether we have this sort of 1930s scenario where every country moves in a protectionist direction, or the U.S. does it sort of unilaterally, and the rest of the world continues on its merry way and isolates the U.S.
All right, our audience has had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll leave it there and tackle the day. Our profound thanks to Douglas Irwin, John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College and author of Clashing Over Commerce, A History of the U.S. Trade Policy. Doug, thank you so much for swinging by this morning.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
And a warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. If you want to connect or suggest a topic, reach out to us via the email on the screen or join the conversation on LinkedIn. If you missed an episode, you can see the replay on our website or catch our podcast edition anytime on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.